Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the Rotary Club of Seattle. I'm Mark Wright, your president. We are the fourth oldest and one of the largest Rotary clubs in the world. If you're visiting us today and you have no idea what Rotary is, a couple of things. We don't have any secret handshakes. We don't take part in any parades. We don't sell anything. We are an international service organization of 1.2 million members in 35,000 clubs all over the world. Our club was founded in 1909. And lives by the motto, service above self. Seattle Rotarians are involved in dozens of service projects here in Seattle and all over the world. We begin our meetings with inspiration and music. Our invocation today will be led by our member Joel Padgett. After that, Mike Colbrese and Marley Iverson will lead us in song. Joel.
Please pray with me. Creator God, you have reminded us in Scripture that we need to be completely humble and gentle, patient, bearing with one another in love. We are to make every effort to keep unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Give us the desire and the energy we need in order to be examples to others, from the top of our society to the very bottom. You have told us that you hear the righteous when we cry out about our troubles. So we better get right with you before our troubles come. We have a hard time understanding how you do it. You give strength to the weary and increase the power of the weak. Even young people tire and grow weary, stumble and fall. But those whose hope is in you will renew their strength. And they will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. As Confucius once said, it does not matter how slow you go, as long as you do not stop. Or as Yogi Berra reminded us, it is not over until it's over. So help us, God, to keep doing good and not grow weary. Amen.
Now it's time for our main program today, change. We human beings don't much like change. Some changes in our lives are fantastic, like when we fall in love or when we have a new baby. But change can and often does upend our lives. Just when things are going well, we lose a job, we get demoted at work, we have a falling out with a friend. And then there's the death of a friend or a loved one, the worst possible kind of change that humans can experience. How we deal with change has a profound impact on the quality of our lives, not only our lives, but the lives of those around us, especially those who depend on us. Richard Groves is here today with a talk titled Saying Yes to Change, a personal and professional guide for times of transition. I first met Richard a couple of years ago when I emceed an event. I was so moved by his wisdom and his insight, I made a mental note that I had to find a way to share him with you here at Rotary, and I'm so glad that Richard is here today. Richard is an internationally acclaimed speaker and author. He and his late wife, Mary, founded the Sacred Art of Living Institute in Bend, Oregon. Richard has taught for more than 30 years. He speaks 9 languages and has degrees in philosophy, religion, and law. The point of today's program is to see that change isn't something to fear, but rather embrace as a natural part of life. This is the first in an occasional series of Seattle 4 programs this year, dedicated to mind, body, and spirit. Please give a warm Rotary welcome to Mr. Richard Groves.
And just thank you for inviting me today, and I look forward to a few minutes to share with you some topics that I've been exploring and teaching for a long time, for half of my lifetime. So the PowerPoint's not showing. Oh, okay. There we go. I guess you'll have to crook your necks over there. I was at the Bend Airport this morning, early, 5 o'clock, getting a flight to Seattle. I had never seen the airport in our little town so overrun by mostly Seattleites, desperately trying to get a flight to back home from the Eclipse event. If you can imagine this, Alaska Airlines finally got on. They were so desperate, and they said, we will give $4,000 to anybody who's willing to give up their seat. And no one did. And I'm thinking, I could drive to Seattle from Bend, you know. So anyway, we've been inundated lately with that through that event. But what I do want to kind of share with you today are some stories about change. So this is not advancing now. We did a dry run about 2 hours ago, so this wouldn't happen, and there you go. So let me start in. Let me start in by telling you about the eclipse. Okay. I had a beautiful picture here that I took with my camera. We were just north of where I live in the path of totality, and so I know you saw a partial eclipse, and I had seen them before as well, but I had never seen a total eclipse, and what an amazing experience that was. Just in that moment when the moon is completely covering the sun, you were able to take off of your eye guard glasses, and this corona event happens. It becomes like midnight. The sky is just filled with stars, and you could just feel across this community, we had hundreds of thousands of people visiting to witness this, that everybody was just like little children, just like kids, in awe and wonder at something that was so much larger than we were. And so that was, let's see, is that working yet? They're still working at it. Okay. The one thing I did find out about, which is part of what I wanted to share with you, and we'll show the picture later, is that you've all learned now about eclipses and why they happen and how rare they are. But, you know, we're not going to see total eclipses of the sun here on Earth forever. And that's because the moon is drifting about 1.5 inches a year away from the Earth in its orbit. Everything is doing that. We're drifting away from the sun, which means that in about 600,000 years, the moon will be so far away from us that we'll get partial eclipses, but we'll never see a total eclipse again. So you better get one in while you can. There we go. I'm hearing audio. Now, if we had video, that would be really fantastic. Man, okay. All right. Well, you know, you fly by the seat of your pants. I was in Thailand speaking recently, and there was no electricity. So, you know, forget the PowerPoints, right? You kind of go with where things are at. The part of change, and I had a series of slides here, is that it is just part of life. You know, the Pangea thesis that once upon a time, all of the planets were basically one landmass. And over a long period of time, eventually through continental drift, there has been change. That's apparently not a thesis anymore. That's been well tested. The fact that I can go to our national park in Oregon, Crater Lake, and see what was once the largest mountain in the Cascades, but because of volcanic explosion, it became the deepest lake in North America. That's a kind of change. There's other kind of change, though, that is more disturbing to us, as Mark referred to. But even on a geological level, when things happen that don't end up beautiful, there is this thing called the Second Law of Thermodynamics that is one of the few infallible laws that in the quantum world we can trust anymore, and that is that entropy is always supreme. In any closed system, entropy is always happening. The more closed the system is, you're guaranteed to have more entropy, and eventually that entropy actually begins to speed up. The best example of it would be an egg. You know, an egg has evolved to be an egg, and it has that one form, which we go and purchase when we buy eggs. But once you break an egg, there are thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of ways in which that egg can break. And so that's an example of entropy. And, you know, like Humpty Dumpty, you can't put the egg back together again once you do. So that's an example of entropy. If you took, you're going to help us out here? Oh, it's there. Well, there's my eclipse picture. Isn't that cool? I mean, I didn't burn out my camera lens. Yeah, just really, really something. And now if we advance, there we go. Here's terra firma, and there's Pangea, and there's Mount Mazama. 6,800 years ago, not that long ago, really, in geological time. And let's see, now we're not advancing My IT friends back there, we seem stuck. There we go, Crater Lake, what Mount Mazama eventually became. This is my dad in 1943. He was in the Marine Corps. And one of his favorite stories was being a Midwest boy from Detroit, Michigan, which is where I was born and raised. This is my favorite souvenir from Dad, who passed away some years ago. It was a postcard from sunny Southern California of oranges on trees in January with snow-capped mountains in the background. And, you know, as a kid from Detroit, that just fascinated me. I wanted to go to Southern California. I actually did end up there eventually in the 1960s and went to school. And in 1968, this is what I encountered. Hey, Dad, what happened? What happened in the course from 1943 to 1968? This was, you couldn't see the mountains anymore, you know. So, you know, there's that kind of change, which, of course, feels like a kind of entropy, doesn't it? There is life after huge cataclysmic entropy, not only at a geological level, but at a geopolitical level. So we know that since 9/11, the world is not the same. We know, for example, going through an airport today, that it's just not the way it was a generation ago, and it just seems like it gets increasingly crazy. There is this thing called the aging process. So change is not just happening out there, it's also happening inside of ourselves. Okay? And so we look in the mirror and we hardly recognize who we were in those pictures back a number of years ago. I think it's fascinating right now this year that we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of JFK's death. And that's an artist's rendition. I think he's probably doing a bit of artist touch up there. You know, at 100 years old, maybe he kept his head of hair, but, you know, there's change. And then there's Elvis. You know, this is the 40th anniversary of Elvis's death. That maybe is closer to what Elvis would have looked like. I don't know. There's Marilyn Monroe at 90. Okay. I guess we look at these things because we're so media-driven that we have an image in our mind of how Jerry Lewis looked when he was doing telethons in the 1970s. And so we can't imagine what people look like when they're 91 years old. And that feels like a kind of entropy, doesn't it? So that second law of thermodynamics that I mentioned to you is one of the few things science says that we can absolutely, infallibly count on. High entropy, more and more change increases, which gives us a signal about what's happening to the container around us. And that's kind of where I want to go with this, with you here this afternoon. This law of thermodynamics, like, you know, one of the commandments, that if you took a bunch of pennies and you flipped them, this is why you'll never win at Vegas. You know, you cannot predict ultimately the pattern of which are going to be heads and which are going to be tails, even down to millions and billions of times. Entropy just, you know, creates unpredictability. And then I talked about the metaphor of entropy in the kitchen through the egg. So that brings me up to now where I was meaning to be. There is this law of dissipative structures. A Ukrainian physicist by the name of Ilya Prigogine won the Nobel Prize for discovering this law. And you know, in physics now, there aren't a lot of laws. There's a lot of chaos theory, but there's not a lot of laws. But imagine the implications of this, that when certain complex systems in the universe break down, we could put in here, always reorganize into a higher order. Really? Boy, that's hopeful. I can look at myself in the mirror and say, this is going somewhere, these wrinkles. Entropy goes somewhere. There are implications to this from the physical world to the organizational and social world. We could look at examples close to home like our Civil War, which was probably our eve of destruction, as Abe Lincoln called it, and recognize that out of that horrendous event came the important liberation of slavery and the beginning, really, of a civil rights movement that continues to our day but is not yet completed. So an example of where entropy led to something that was ultimately useful. We could think of the kind of public disorientation when I was in college and the Vietnam War was going on and my generation was getting drafted to Nam. The kind of passion around that, around a war that we were not going to win, around the civil rights movement, again, around terrorism in 9/11. We could look today, because so many social commentators say we haven't been as divided in this country as since the American Civil War. I don't know if that's true. I don't know how you'd prove that, but you know, it certainly at times feels like that if you read the news. So, can we trust the law of physics that says no matter to what extent entropy takes place, that out of that breakdown inevitably comes something that is a higher order? And if that's true out there, if we could prove that from a social science point of view, how are the implications of that for our own personal lives and our family and organizational lives? So I'm going to mention a few books to you because I'd like to leave you with some good reading material if this kind of topic piques your interest. This is good bathroom material. You could have this in the bathroom. You could go back to this for years. By the way, if any of you are interested in the full PowerPoint slide that I have here on the table, there's a little half sheet of paper, and this is my little bait. If you give me your contact information, I'll send it to you. So no other obligation required. But Kelly McGonigal's book, The Upside of Stress, is an exploration from the point of psychology and social science of the proof that what I'm saying in terms of the physical universe, in fact, very much is true in terms of our social structures and organizational life. But she says you have to make an important distinction. And you've probably heard this before. I'm talking to an enlightened group of Seattleites here. You know, the difference between change and transition. So we often interchange the two words, but they're different. They're radically different. Change is just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Transition means there's a before and after. And that after transitional change, something really is radically, profoundly different, and it will never go back to the same place. That's the difference between change, which is external, organizational, quicker, more visible, physical, tangible. This is the stuff we're experiencing. This is what's driving us crazy. You can't keep up with it. You just get one of these, and they tell you there's going to be a better one, you know, with a camera that does 3D, I don't know, can teleport you to a different planet. I mean, where does this end? See, that's change at a certain level. Transition is something that's happening at a more deep level, because when transition happens, there's no going back. Change is all over the place. It's very erratic. So we can talk about transition as something that we would more want to pay attention to. Neuroscience brings this closer to home in terms of how our brains are structured. And I find this part in my teaching the most appealing. The neuroscience of change and why it is so difficult for us as human beings really to make those changes. This is an interesting piece of data. When heart disease patients who had undergone traumatic bypass surgery were told that if they did not adjust their lifestyle, they would literally die or at least face another similar procedure again. I mean, that's scary stuff, right? Only 9% modified their behavior. Are we really that dense as a species? Do we just go back to bacon cheeseburgers? The science seems to indicate that more of us will than not. Why? Well, there's a neurobiological reason for that. Our brains are extremely effective in tenaciously maintaining the status quo. This is partly that reptilian brain that evolved this way, or from which we came, I guess, that helps us survive. So Dan Siegel, who's a great neurobiologist that loves to wax eloquent about this stuff, and you can look up Dan's YouTube videos. He's got 100 of them online. Little 5-minute teachings on this stuff. Says there's in the brain an X system and a C system. Okay? The X system is the habitual response system. It's reflexive, it's energy efficient. It doesn't want to change because it takes a lot of energy to change. The C system challenges and corrects the X system. It takes us to higher order thinking, and that's what you've got to activate in order to make profound transition, not change. It's why so many of us make those New Year's resolutions and by February 1st they're over. Because we're sort of defaulting back to that X system. So what would make the difference here? How would we be able to activate the C system after we had a quadruple bypass, or after we've experienced the loss of a loved one through divorce or through death, or through any of the other kinds of major transitions that happen in life? Well, the good news is, and this apparently we don't share with our animal friends, we have as human beings this ability called neuroplasticity. It's partly what distinguishes us. You can locate it where the origin of this is in a certain part of the brain. And what it means is that there are certain tried and true, and this has been double-blind, randomized, studied now and tried. This used to be a generation ago when I was first teaching this stuff woo-woo. Go do yoga, go to whatever, and you're gonna, Now we have Harvard Medical School, we have Cleveland Clinic, we have the most testing available to us that shows that things like exercising willpower, focused attention, emotional intelligence, new behavioral rituals, coaching and mindfulness, meditation practices, we could go on and add yoga among them, that these in fact do access that C aspect of the neural pathways and help us not just change but transition. Any of you who are involved in organizational life need to know about Frederic Laloux's book, Reinventing Organizations. I guess I can actually take this off and move behind this podium, can't I? I'll give you the crib notes, and then you got to read the book. And if you are an organizational leader, you just should have this, not in the bathroom. There should be, on your desk when you're doing HR development and long-term planning. 8 out of 10 current jobs will become obsolete in the next 18 years from now, from 2017, or will have changed so drastically as to require a different skill set. Nothing will be the same in shorter and shorter increment period of time. So how do you plan towards that? Only organizations will survive that can break the rules that are no longer working. I mean, you guys have got a lot of pioneering spirit here in Seattle who knew about rule breaking some time ago. Who would have thought you'd ever spend $7.50 for a coffee drink? I mean, all over the world. All over the world. God bless Starbucks. And along with it, the creative thinking behind an organization like that. The best business solutions will not begin with the question, how much does it cost? Boy, if we could start there, if we caught this, because that's often where we do start. We think we're accountable to our boards, to our stakeholders, and therefore that's the starting point. The creative pioneers will not begin with that question. The workplace of the future will bring together the soul and role of employees, or it will cease to be relevant. Our millennials are going to demand this. My generation doesn't get this yet. What does that mean, bringing together soul and role? I'm not just going to go to the salt mines and put in my time. I will not do it. It will meet the deepest yearning of who I am as a human being, and it will fulfill that, or else I'm going to move on, in spite of all the education and training I might have gotten. And then we have to look to those pioneers who have already cracked the code. So let me give you just a brief talk about fast skim over another book called Deep Change by Dr. Susan Plummer, somebody who was here from Santa Barbara. Susan lives in Santa Barbara and is a colleague who wrote this marvelous book. And I think she puts it together better than I've ever seen it. And I've been using it as kind of a textbook in our programs that we teach in this country and around the world. No one wants to do it, real change. No, but we go here screaming and kicking. Not soul change, however you want to define that. Not the painful molecular change required to truly become who you need to be. Nobody ever does real transformation for fun. Nobody ever does it on a dare. You do it only when your back is so far against the wall that you have no choice anymore. And we will, as we continue to live and breathe as human beings and have the opportunity to be on this planet, we will have this opportunity at faster and faster pace. So Susan looks at the theories of Carl Jung, and she articulates this way. She says there are 5 predictable stages, just like in quantum science, that you can point to if you would go back in your life and if you look at any major change that happened in your life. From getting married to making a major job change or whatever, you will find, in fact, especially in those changes which you didn't want, that these happen in this order. It's amazing. It's almost like it's molecular in us. That there is this first stage that gives us a hint that, it's not going to be about rearranging the deck chairs here. It's going to be about major transformation. It's called the unsettling stage. Something is dying. You get up one morning and you just know that life is not going to continue the way it has. And this happens instinctively around business. It happens in family life. It happens in our personal lives. Something is dying, and I'm going to go into this thing called neutral zone. But before I go there, there's going to be all of the agony and anxiety and fear that happens with any kind of death. And then it kind of settles down. And in this unsettling stage, where there's a sense that the status quo isn't working anymore, where there's a yearning for change, along with some dread to leave the familiar behind. This is what defines it. There's a stage that's always uncomfortable, and you don't know the answers, you don't know the outcome, and you come to trust that not knowing is the key. When you try to figure this out, what you end up with is change, not transition. How many people end up in serial relationships with the same kind of problem? I married my father and my mother because there was change going on and not transition. So it can happen at the personal level, at the corporate level. What it does is it sets afoot this next stage called the opening. When you are there, and if you have a good friend who can name this for you, they will tell you at this point, you cannot go back. The only way out is through. If you think you can avoid all of the struggle and suffering of letting something familiar behind and moving to a radically new way of being in the world, you can forget it. And you all know this. So that's a Robert Frost quote. The only way out, the best way out is always through. So my new favorite book, now Thomas Friedman's been around for a long time. Probably some of you know him. But this book, Thank You for Being Late, put it on your high reading list. Either your reader or get the hard copy. And I'll give you the summary of it. And I think he's not just blowing smoke here. I think this guy is a futurist who has done his work. He claims that in places like this, Seattle, this was the epicenter of something that was going on in 2007. He can actually pinpoint it to that year. A supernova of unparalleled change has been released in the form of technology and globalization that is transforming geopolitics, business, ethics, and community. No matter how many changes we think we have encountered in past generations, the epoch we are entering will radically affect everything from how we shop and hail a taxi to the fate of nations and our most intimate relationships. Being late is a field manual for pausing to grasp and appreciate the amazing epoch we're passing through and to reflect on its possibilities and danger. We need this kind of feedback, personally, and we need it organizationally. Because the other 3 stages are, strap yourself in, hang on for the ride. It's where it goes. The unraveling stage. Parker Palmer, whose Center for Courage and Renewal is just down the street here in Seattle. Parker's center and our center have been sister centers for quite a number of years. We began about 20 years ago. Parker's work, if you don't know him, this is genius. He set out to transform public education in every state of the country, the Courage to Teach program. And then his Courage to Heal program is now trying to transform healthcare. This is a genius living in your midst. Parker comes from a Quaker tradition. And he wanted to find non-religious ways of describing this for people that came from the wisdom traditions. And he says the Quakers talked about this thing called a tragic gap. It's a gap between the way things are and the way you know they might be. So, for example, one of my heroes is Bill Healy. If you've ever been to Bend, Oregon, if you're a skier, you know Mount Bachelor is there because of this one man. This one man. Imagine a young man, really in his prime, getting struck with a horrible neurological disease that made it not possible for him to walk. Suddenly, he's in hospice. I'm involved as a hospice chaplain in those days, and we look at the unraveling that's going on. The U.S. Olympic ski team is coming for the first time to Bend, Oregon, from all over the world, and Bill cannot go to the mountain. So we say, well, let's invite Bill here. And he didn't want people coming and seeing him in this condition. And I convinced his wife and family, no, come, this would be a good thing to do. And Bill, from his bedside, with his stories, and in his disability, was a far more powerful model to those young hot dog skiers than somebody who is 50 who could be out there skiing. That's what can begin to happen on the other side of this kind of entropy. It was a tragic gap that got transformed. So I would say, and you can I'll plant the seed here in your minds, and maybe the rest of today or this evening or tomorrow, you might come back to this question. In your job, in your profession, your core relationships, your faith community, it can happen anywhere. Name where right now you find yourself standing in a tragic gap. A place where there's a difference between the way things are and the way you know or wish they could be. If you don't have one of these, I don't know, you walk on water. I mean, if you don't think there's tragic gaps in our politics and in everything, they're all over the place, okay? You know, and we're lucky. I mean, think of tragic gaps of people who barely have enough food to eat in the morning. So Parker would say, when you sit with that kind of question, you don't solve it. You name it. You have the courage to name it. This is part of that unsettling process. And you decide that I can either go back and marinate in my suffering, or I can choose to live an undivided life. The entropy of my life breaking down is an opening, a crack in the surface of reality that gives me a chance to no longer put my professional life here and my personal life there, but to put soul and role together, as the millennials say they're going to demand of us. Once you jump off the cliff and trust that a net will appear, that's what it takes. It's an amazing leap of faith. There is a kind of stilling that takes place. And the stilling is about really finally acknowledging that the world as it was will never be for you or for the larger world. I know many of you have seen this quote from Stanford University address that Steve Jobs gave, which was so powerful because if you've seen the movies on his life, you know, the guy was kind of a creep personally. And a genius creep. And in the last months of his life, as he says here through this quote, found the key for the first time to real inner peace and happiness. How weird. A terminal illness, and now I'm at peace? Is that possible? That's what the work of Sacred Art of Living Center has been about for 20 years. Trusting, in fact, creating a university all over the planet. We have about 22,000 professional graduates here in the United States and that many more in Canada and other parts of the world through workshops called The Sacred Art of Living and Dying. And this is not about just death and dying in hospice. By the way, we began our work out of Oregon here in Seattle with Providence and Swedish hospitals 20 years ago, and we're coming back for the first time in September, and there's a flyer on your table in Kirkland, Washington through Evergreen Hospital. And I just want to mention that not as a high-pressure commercial, but if any of this appeals to you, I tell you the best people that come to these workshops are carpenters and construction workers and real estate agents and attorneys and doctors and everybody. You know, we all can benefit from sitting with these big questions and going back to life with renewed perspective. Because once you face the fact I would put it this way in our teaching, to die before you die, so that when you die, you will not die. Think of all the deaths of ego, the letting goes that you have to do. If nothing else, just live long enough, and as you age, I'm a great-grandpa now, I see them daily, all the deaths. And by being able to move into that with a kind of grace and courage, what comes out on the other side of it is not ugly, it's not entropy, it's beautiful. It leads to the releasing, which is why I always in my programs, and normally I get to speak for hours and days, and so I don't know if, I rarely have to do a program in 30 minutes. This is just hell for me. But anyway, so that's why I talk so fast. But I always work in a picture of my wife, Mary, and I want to end with this and tell you one story because she died back in 2009. So she was the love of my life. I was a Roman Catholic priest. I was a canon lawyer. I worked in bishops' offices all over the country during the height of the clergy sex abuse crisis, if you think that was fun. I was watching Entropy big time happening. And I was going to a program, and I was in a car accident in the wintertime, hit a patch of black ice, broke my neck in 4 places, was within a hair of being a quadriplegic, had a spinal fusion, and for 6 months of my life, I could no longer write or teach or work, and that was my life. I thought I was going to die. This beautiful woman shows up. She was already working in our education center, and she was not a nurse. She was just a human being who knew that I was dying inside and helped me to hold that tension, that tragic gap. Eventually, years later, we were married and had a family and children and grandchildren, and that entropy of that accident was what opened me up, what finally let me let go of a part of life I couldn't live so that something else was possible. The work that we created, Sacred Heart Living Center, for the last 20 years, and even after Mary's death, has been about sharing these stories with people all over the country. I was at the Raymond James Conference in Orlando a few months ago, 10,000 people, their annual conference. These are financial planners. And I'm thinking, sure, they're bringing me in to talk about death and dying. This is really what they're going to want to listen to, right? They're going to be heading out the door. But in fact, what there was like a confession line of hundreds of people after the talk that I gave, because these are people sitting with human beings who are looking at mortality and long-term planning, and it's not just about money. It's about life and energy and the important values and meaning in life. So someone like Mary, who comes into my life, finally, in my language, thank you, God, for this great gift, and then she dies. Cancer. Well, this is really shitty. I'm sorry, and I'm supposed to say that. This is just, I'm sorry, this is unacceptable. This is unacceptable. This is a human being who should be on the planet. So let me tell you one short story, and then I'll end and open it up for questions. Mary and I had traveled all over the world. We were interested in the history of how ancient cultures, civilizations, spiritualities dealt with death and dying. And one of the most wonderful places was in the Holy Land, where we ran across this amazing little tiny piece of Roman glass, still intact. You can find them there around the soldiers' barracks from the Roman times, 2,000 years ago. Found out that the Roman soldiers used to take these, have one blown, glass blown, and wear it in a leather pouch when they went into battle. And what was it called? It was called a tear cup. The bigger the tear cup, the more of a man you were. Because there was going to be death and loss and horror. And you would catch those tears. The tears were not a sign of shame for these soldiers. They were a badge of honor. They were a sacrament. And you would catch those tears. And the cup that was given to me that Mary discovered, which she wrote a note, and it was only after she died that she had me open this up. She says, I want you to use this tear cup. And I want those tears of sadness to also become tears of joy, because you can't separate the two. When I do small retreats, especially for men, I take those tear cups around because guys are notoriously terrible at showing their emotions. We know that. And how wonderful and encouraging to think that in other cultures there is this kind of wisdom. So as I wrap this up here, I want to just share one thing with you that's on the table there, and I have a little film here that I don't think I have enough time for. Where's my time? I've got 6 minutes, yeah, so I'll wrap this up. There's the program we're doing here at Evergreen, which maybe some of you will consider in September, and there's a half sheet of paper, and if you give us your contact information and leave it here, I will send you these PowerPoints. But the main reason, selfishly, no money involved, I'd like to have you look at that piece of paper, is to go to a website called soulandscience.org. There are hundreds and thousands of links to videos about these topics from some of the world's great teachers. And we were given a grant to be able to put this together. And I just love to have people know about it. You can test drive some of the series free. And I'm also just putting this out here because I'm with so many people from Seattle. If you have a topic, when you look at that website, teen suicide, the problems of eldering and loneliness, you name it, that is worthy of a Soul and Science video series where nurses and doctors and social workers and chaplains can get continuing education, please call that number. We are networking with people all over the world to create this video. It'll be an online video encyclopedia of resources on these kinds of topics. So I wanted to leave that with you as well. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. Raise your hand if you have one. I've been accused of, when you sit in my talks, of being like at the end of a fire hose with just lots of information. But if maybe someone's, not just a question, but an observation would be great, or
I'll ask you a question.
Yes.
Considering the basic tenets of Western thought and you're laughing already, the various leaders such as Julius Caesar maybe, people who really tried to, and even the Egyptians, people who tried to impress upon the mind consistency or status quo. How does a modern leader go back through all of that history using the mind-brain psychology and Prigogine and dissipative structures and concepts of self-organizing systems? How does the modern mind go back through all that history, rearrange those synapses and neural programming to come up with something that would win today?
What a question. Now do we have an hour so we can explore that? I hope we got to meet you afterwards. Short answer. 1955, the double helix DNA had been discovered. Albert Einstein said, we don't even know what this will begin to unleash in the universe. He said, but this much I predict, and this is a real Einstein quote. In the 21st century, in the third millennium, he said, our theologians will be our scientists. Our science is going to begin to put us in awe of all of these things that our wisdom traditions have been trying to struggle with and that are true. But science is going to bring it to us in a way that maybe the modern mind can understand or can. So when I see science confirming and affirming the fact that I can always trust that after death there's resurrection, using language, or after, there's Passover, there's whatever the spiritual tradition is. If I can begin to trust that that's true at a physiological level, at a microcosmic level, then that's an affirmation to me of a kind of faith. You know how many people out there, especially in the millennial generation, want nothing to do, I'm a former chaplain, with formal religion. None of that stuff. But they are profoundly spiritual human beings. And I think that's going to be some of the energy that's going to change the planet. So, long answer. One short question, shorty, or observation. Argument or disagreements are okay too, So, all right, looks like. Thank you.
In closing, the one thing that you said today that is really just hit me in my chest is that identify that gap in your job, profession, core relationship, or faith community. Name where you find yourself standing in that tragic gap, that place where there is a difference between the way things are and the way they could or wish they could be. If you think about that thought, in the mid-1980s, Rotarians stood in that tragic gap when 350,000 people a year were getting polio. and they said, what if polio could be eradicated? And Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but Steve Crane, 9 cases in the world this year? That's because of Rotarians and some of you in the room. You got off your couches and you went to Africa and you delivered polio vaccine, taking vacation time to do it. So you stood in that tragic gap, and I think as Rotarians, that defines us. We stand in that gap all the time and we say, how can we end homelessness in Seattle? How can we end polio in the world? There is no challenge too big for us as an organization. So let's embrace that gap. Let's stand there in courage together. We can do it. We are doing it. We will do it. Thank you so much, Richard. It's a blessing to have you here. We are adjourned, and I hope to see you next week.